All right, let's kick off another deep dive. Today, we're going to be exploring how AI is shaking up Web3 development. And I have to say, it's pretty mind-blowing stuff. I found this newsletter by a Web3 developer who they actually used a whole bunch of different AI coding assistants during a hackathon. Can you believe it?
Oh, wow. Hackathons are a fantastic way to see what these tools can really do, you know? It's a real-world setting under pressure, got to think on your feet.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to unpack in this deep dive. We'll look at what works, what doesn't, and what to watch out for if you're thinking of using AI to build your own Web3 projects. Now, the developer, they started by talking about how much they learned during the hackathon itself, like that intense time crunch and focus. It seems to really accelerate the learning process.
Absolutely. You're thrown in the deep end, and you have to learn quickly to stay afloat, you know? It's like a boot camp, but for developers.
Totally. And speaking of getting up to speed quickly, the developer mentioned finding this YouTube tutorial by Sahil all about building on QuickNote's infrastructure.
Yeah.
And he really emphasized the importance of starting with something called the Scaffold ETH2 template. Have you worked with this template before?
Yeah, I have. It's become super popular in the Web3 development community. It gives you like a pre-built structure and a set of tools that handle a lot of the basic setup for a decentralized application, a DApp.
Oh, right, dApps.
So essentially, it lets you focus on building the unique features of your DApp without reinventing the wheel every time.
Gotcha. So it's like having a solid foundation to build on rather than starting from scratch.
Exactly. It's like, think of it like building a house. You wouldn't start by making your own bricks, right?
Right.
You'd use pre-made ones so you could focus on the design and layout. Well, Scaffold S2 is like those pre-made bricks, but for Web3.
That makes a lot of sense.
Uh-huh.
So for their hackathon project, the developer decided to build a fundraising DApp.
Nice. That's a great choice, really, for pushing the limits of AI coding assistance, because it involves several complex features.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The developer wanted it to have multiple categories for fundraising,
Yeah.
shareable URLs, real-time fund tracking, campaign management tools, you name it.
Wow, the whole shebang.
It's ambitious.
Yeah.
And to build it all, they used a bunch of different AI assistants like Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini, Perplexity, even GitHub Copilot. It's like an AI showdown.
It's really fascinating to see how each tool performed against the same challenge. It highlights their strengths and weaknesses.
Absolutely. So let's start with Claude. This AI really impressed the developer, especially with how well it understood that Scaffold ETH2 template we were just talking about.
Yeah, that's one of Claude's key strengths. It's able to grasp the underlying architecture of a project and generate code that integrates seamlessly with that framework. For the developer, this meant they could quickly create things like custom React hooks, which are, reusable building blocks for their DApp, and it ensures that all the code adhered to Solidity best practices.
So using Claude, it's like having an expert Web3 developer looking over your shoulder and guiding you.
Pretty much, yeah. And in this case, Claude even went a step further. It helped create the Solidity contracts that govern the DApp's logic.
Solidity contracts. Can you explain those for our listeners who might not be familiar?
Sure. In simple terms, a Solidity contract is like a set of rules, written in code that defines how a DApp functions. It's what makes a DApp smart, able to execute transactions automatically. So for a fundraising DApp, the Solidity contract would determine things like how donations are collected, how funds are distributed, and how the campaign is managed.
Okay, that makes sense. So Claude was able to generate these complex contracts based on the developer's prompts.
Yes, and to a high standard, according to the newsletter, it even gave really detailed folder structure recommendations.
Wow, that's impressive. It sounds like Claude was a dream to work with. Were there any downsides?
Well, the developer did mention that the free version of Claude has limitations on how long you can maintain a conversation with it.
Oh, so like it times out.
Yeah, basically. And that can be frustrating if you're in the middle of something complex.
I can imagine.
And there were a few instances where Claude struggled with rendering some of the user interface components correctly. But overall, it seems like a very powerful tool for Web3 development.
Great. Now let's talk about another AI that was in the mix. ChatGPT. This one is super popular right now.
Yeah, it's known for its speed and its ability to generate a lot of code very quickly. The developer found it helpful for generating code examples and getting quick answers.
So it's like having a super fast coding buddy on hand.
Sort of, yeah. But the developer did note that ChatGPT's code wasn't always the most elegant or efficient. Sometimes it missed some of the best practices for Solidity, and the React components it generated were a bit basic.
So it sounds like ChatGPT is more of a quick and dirty coder, whereas Claude is more thoughtful and meticulous.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. ChatGPT can be helpful for rapid prototyping or getting a basic structure in place, but for a complex project like this fundraising DApp, you'd probably want a more refined approach.
Right, so ChatGPT is great for brainstorming and getting started, but then you might need a more specialized tool like Claude to polish things up and ensure your code is solid. What about the other AI tools? The developer mentioned using Gemini, Perplexity, and GitHub Copilot.
Right. Yes, they did. Let's talk about those next.
Perfect. And we'll come back after a quick break. See you in a minute. So we were looking at this Web3 developers AI showdown during their hackathon. They tried out ChatGPT and Claude, but also experimented with Gemini, Perplexity, and GitHub Copilot. What can you tell us about those?
Well, each of these tools brings something a little different to the table. Gemini, for instance, really stood out for its ability to explain concepts clearly. The developer found it helpful for getting a deeper understanding of certain aspects of Web3 development, like really grasping the fundamentals.
So it's like having a patient teacher, like walking you through the trickier parts.
Yeah, exactly. But while Gemini was great at explaining things, it wasn't as strong when it came to actually generating code. It provided more theoretical guidance than practical, hands-on help.
That makes sense. Sometimes you need that clear explanation before you can even start coding. So Gemini is like that foundational piece. What about Perplexity?
Perplexity kind of landed somewhere between Gemini and the other code-focused AIs. It provided context and explanations along with its code suggestions, so the developer found it useful for quickly exploring different approaches.
So a good tool for getting the big picture and testing out some ideas.
Exactly. However, it didn't go as deep into the implementation details as, say, Claude or even ChatGPT.
Interesting. So each tool has its own quirks and strengths. And it seems like the best approach is to use them strategically, based on what you need at that moment. What about GitHub Copilot? That one works a little differently, right?
Yeah, GitHub Copilot is more of a real-time coding partner. It integrates directly into your development environment and offers suggestions as you type. You can think of it like an autocomplete, but for code.
Oh, I see. I can see how that would be super helpful, especially if you're working on a complex project and need a little nudge in the right direction.
Exactly. The developer found Copilot especially useful for tasks that involved repetitive code patterns, like setting up data structures or handling user interface elements.
So it's like having an extra set of hands helping you speed up those more tedious parts of coding. Did the developer have a favorite AI assistant overall?
Well, they didn't really declare a single winner. Instead, they advocated for a mix and match approach, using different tools for different stages of the development process.
That makes sense to me. It's like having a whole team of AI specialists, each with their own expertise. Did they share any tips for, working effectively with these AI tools?
They did, yeah. One of the key takeaways was the importance of starting with a solid template, like that scaffold F2 we talked about earlier. That provides a strong foundation and helps prevent common errors.
So even with AI assistance, you still got to lay the groundwork properly.
Absolutely. Another tip was to break down complex tasks into smaller, more manageable prompts for the AI. This helps it focus and generate more accurate code.
It's like giving the AI bite-sized pieces instead of overwhelming it with the whole meal at once.
Ah, yeah, good analogy. And of course, the developer stressed the importance of always verifying the code generated by AI. You should never blindly trust it.
Right, you're still the captain of the ship, so to speak. The AI is your first mate, but you need to double-check its work and make sure it aligns with your vision. Anything else?
The developer also emphasized security. Web3 is still relatively new and evolving, and there are unique security challenges to consider.
That's a good point. You're dealing with decentralized networks, digital assets, and smart contracts that can be tough to modify once they're deployed.
Exactly. So even when using AI to speed up development, it's crucial to keep those security best practices in mind. This includes carefully reviewing all code, testing thoroughly, and seeking expert advice when needed.
Speaking of expert advice, what are your thoughts on the future of AI-powered Web3 development? I mean, this developer's experience seems to suggest that we're on the verge of something big.
I agree, yeah. I think we're just scratching the surface of what's possible. As these tools become more sophisticated, they'll empower developers to create even more complex, secure, and user-friendly dApps.
That's exciting. It sounds like AI could really democratize access to Web3 development, making it easier for anyone to build and launch their own dApps.
I believe so, yeah. Imagine a world where you don't need to be a coding whiz to create a decentralized marketplace, a social media platform, or even a new financial system.
Wow, that's pretty mind-blowing. But as with any powerful technology, I imagine there are potential risks to consider as well. What should developers be mindful of as they embrace these AI tools?
I think one of the biggest challenges will be ensuring the quality and reliability of AI-generated code. While these tools are becoming increasingly impressive, they're not perfect. There's always a risk of errors or vulnerabilities slipping through the cracks.
So it's crucial for developers to stay vigilant and not become overly reliant on AI. They still need to understand those underlying principles of Web3 development and be able to critically evaluate the code being generated.
Absolutely, yeah. It's about finding the right balance between human expertise and AI assistance. Developers need to be the architects, guiding the AI and ensuring it's building according to their specifications.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, this has been an incredibly insightful discussion. I'm feeling both excited and a little overwhelmed by the possibilities, to be honest.
Uh-huh, yeah. It's definitely a rapidly evolving field, but that's part of what makes it so fascinating.
Before we wrap up, you mentioned that the developers shared some helpful resources in their newsletter. Could you remind our listeners what those were?
Sure thing. They highly recommended checking out the Scaffold F2 template, QuickNode for its blockchain infrastructure, and Defolio for its hackathon opportunities. Oh, and they also mentioned a really great tutorial by Sahil that explains how to get started with Web3 development on QuickNode.
Fantastic. We'll be sure to include links to all of those resources in the show notes. And for our listeners who are ready to dive into AI-powered Web3 development, what advice would you give them?
Say, jump in and experiment. There are so many great tools and resources available now, so don't be afraid to try things out, break things, and learn as you go. That's how you'll really discover the power of these AI assistants.
Great advice. And I'd add, stay curious, stay informed, and stay connected with the Web3 community. There's a lot happening in this space, and it's an exciting time to be involved.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dive.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing to think about how much AI is already impacting Web3 development. These AI assistants aren't just, helping with small tasks anymore. They're actually capable of tackling these big, complex projects.
Yeah, it really feels like a whole new era. The developer we've been talking about, they mentioned this video they watched comparing different large language models, or LLMs, for coding. These are the brains behind the AI assistants we've been discussing, like Claude and ChatGPT.
Right. I think I remember them saying that Claude came out on top in that comparison.
Yeah, exactly. Claude was able to create, full smart contracts and even user interface components just from those detailed prompts.
It's incredible. What makes Claude so good at this?
It seems like Claude just has this really strong grasp of programming concepts and best practices. The developer even mentioned that it could adapt to different coding styles and frameworks, so it's super versatile.
So it's not just like blindly spitting out code,
Yeah.
right? It's actually understanding what it's doing and then tailoring its output to the specific needs of the project.
Exactly. And while other AI assistants like ChatGPT, Gemini, and Perplexity were good for generating code snippets and explanations, they weren't quite as good at handling those bigger, more complex tasks.
It seems like we're moving beyond simple code completion towards AI assistants that can really collaborate with developers on a deeper level.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. It's a shift from AI as just a productivity booster to AI as like a creative partner.
That's a really interesting point, because if AI can handle so much of the heavy lifting in Web3 development, what does that actually mean for human developers? Are we all going to be out of a job?
I don't think so. In fact, I think AI will make developers even more valuable.
How so?
Well, instead of spending their time on tedious tasks, developers can focus on the higher level aspects of their projects. Things like design, strategy, user experience, the creative stuff.
So AI takes care of the nuts and bolts,
Yeah,
and human developers can be the visionaries.
precisely. And we can't forget about the importance of human oversight. AI is getting better, but it's still crucial to have those experienced developers guiding the process, ensuring the quality and security of the code.
Right, making sure everything aligns with the overall vision.
Ex
It's not about replacing human developers. It's about augmenting their abilities.
Absolutely.
It's a partnership, a collaboration between human ingenuity and artificial intelligence.
I like that.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling incredibly optimistic about the future of Web3 development.
Me too.
It's clear that AI is going to play a big role in shaping this space.
Yeah, I think we're at the beginning of something really incredible.
Any final thoughts or advice for our listeners?
I would say just embrace these new tools. Stay curious. Don't be afraid to experiment. The world of Web3 is constantly evolving, and the only limit is your imagination. And of course, never stop learning.
Well said. A huge thank you to our expert for joining us today.
It was my pleasure.
And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into AI-powered Web3 development. We hope you learned something new and that you're feeling inspired to explore this exciting world. Until next time, keep those minds curious and stay tuned for more deep dives into the topics that matter.